A millionaire leaves an important business meeting and gets into his luxury car when he feels small, cold hands covering his mouth. A child's voice urgently whispers in his ear, "Don't say anything, uncle, they are listening to you." When he turns around, terrified, he sees a 6-year-old girl hidden in the back seat, with wide eyes full of fear. With the innocence of a child, but the desperation of someone who witnessed something terrible, what she says next leaves him completely shocked. The fine winter rain formed small puddles on the dark asphalt of Founder's Way, reflecting the yellowed glow of the streetlights like shattered gold. Edward Monroe adjusted his cashmere overcoat as he walked briskly toward his black Mercedes-Benz S-Class, parked in the gloom between two sycamores. The cold air cut at his face like tiny, invisible razors, and the distinct smell of rain on concrete mingled with the distant aroma of coffee wafting from a shuttered bistro. At 52, Edward had built a financial empire few could fathom. His hands, always impeccably manicured, trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the tension built up over 3 hours of intense negotiations. The meeting had ended better than he'd hoped. The merger with the Japanese firm was practically sealed, guaranteeing another $20 million in profits over the next 2 years. His footsteps echoed in the silence of the nearly deserted street. Only the distant hum of traffic on the main freeway broke the stillness of the commercial district. Edward always chose to park on this side street. Less traffic, more security, he thought. As a man accustomed to controlling every detail of his life, he never left anything to chance. As he neared the vehicle, an indefinable something made the hairs on his arms stand up. Perhaps it was just the accumulated exhaustion from weeks of working 16-hour days, or the constant pressure of staying at the top of a ruthless market. Edward paused for a moment, taking a deep breath of the cold air that burned his lungs slightly. "It's all right," he murmured to himself, a practice he'd developed in recent months to control his rising anxiety. His therapist had suggested the technique, though he would never publicly admit he needed psychological help. To the outside world, Edward Monroe was the personification of absolute success. He unlocked the car with the key fob. The familiar click of the doors brought a momentary sense of relief. Inside that space of Italian leather and cutting-edge technology, he felt truly at home. It was where he took his most important calls, where he planned his most audacious business strategies. He opened the driver's door and settled into the ergonomic seat that automatically adjusted to his measurements. The scent of new leather still lingered. Even after 6 months of use, Edward closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself a few seconds of relaxation before starting the engine and heading home, where a solitary meal and 2 more hours of work awaited him. That's when he felt it. Small hands, cold as ice, covering his mouth gently, but with enough firmness to stop any sound. Edward's heart hammered violently, pumping pure adrenaline through his veins. His eyes flew open in absolute terror as a childish voice, sweet but desperate, whispered urgently in his right ear. "Shh! Don't say anything, mister. They're listening to you." The world seemed to stop completely. Edward could feel each heartbeat reverberating in his ears like war drums. His hands trembled uncontrollably on the steering wheel as he tried to process the impossible. There was a child in his car. Slowly, with movements controlled by fear, he turned to look in the rearview mirror. What he saw made his blood run cold. A little girl, about 6 years old, was huddled on the back seat, her enormous brown eyes shining with unshed tears and a terror no child should ever know. "They put a bug in your car, and they know where you're going," she whispered with the urgency of someone carrying a deadly secret. "They're going to make you have an accident." The words hit Edward like physical blows. Everything around him, the streetlights, the distant sounds, even his own breath, became secondary to that terrifying revelation. His rational mind scrambled to find logical explanations, but the genuine despair in the child's eyes spoke louder than any skepticism. Edward remained motionless for long seconds, his ragged breath creating small clouds of vapor in the car's cold air. The girl stayed crouched on the back seat, her small fingers still touching his right shoulder lightly. He could feel the tremor in her tiny hands, a fear that echoed his own. Who are they? Edward managed to whisper, his hoarse voice betraying the panic he fought to control. All his experience in complex negotiations, all his ability to remain calm under pressure, had vanished in the face of this surreal situation. The girl glanced quickly out the car windows before answering, her movements betraying a vigilance that shouldn't exist in someone so young. "The men in the dark suits," she murmured, shrinking even further. "They were talking a lot about you. Said you have to disappear." A chill ran down Edward's spine. Men in dark suits. The vague description could apply to hundreds of people in his professional circle, but something in the way the child spoke suggested specific knowledge, details only someone who had actually heard them could possess. "Where did you see them?" Edward turned completely in his seat, studying the girl's smudged face. Even in the dim light, he could see she hadn't had a proper bath in days. Her clothes were old and too small for her, and there was a small scar above her left eyebrow. "In the abandoned house near the overpass," she replied, pointing vaguely south. "I sleep there sometimes. Last night they showed up and started talking. They said your name a lot, Edward Munro." Hearing his full name from the child's mouth made Edward's heart pound again. This wasn't a delusion, not his imagination. Someone was truly planning something against him, and a street kid had become an unwilling witness to a conspiracy. Did they say anything else? Edward forced himself to keep his voice calm, though his fists were clenched so tight, his nails dug into his palms. The girl nodded gravely. "They said you always leave work at the same time, that you always park on this street, and that—" She hesitated, biting her lower lip. "And that after tomorrow, you won't be bothering anyone anymore. After tomorrow." The words echoed in Edward's mind like a death knell. Thursday. He had a crucial presentation on Thursday for international investors. It was set to be the most important day of his business career. "Why did you come to warn me?" Edward asked, genuinely intrigued. In his world of ambition and corporate betrayals, altruistic gestures were as rare as diamonds. The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back with impressive determination. "Last week you gave me food. Remember? It was raining hard and I was hungry outside your building. You stopped and gave me a sandwich and some money." Edward searched his memory. There were so many homeless people on the streets of the financial district. Then he remembered one rainy afternoon, leaving a meeting late. He'd seen a small figure shivering in the cold. He'd given her $20 and a sandwich he'd bought for himself. It had been an automatic, almost unconscious gesture. "Nobody's ever been nice to me without wanting something back," she continued. "When I heard them say your name, I knew I had to warn you because you were nice." Edward felt something break inside him, a lifetime built on mistrust and cold calculation. And here was a child risking her own safety because of a simple act of kindness he barely even remembered. "Look," the girl whispered urgently, pointing discreetly through the windshield. "There, that's one of the men." Edward followed her gaze and felt his blood freeze. About 50 yards away, standing under the weak light of a street lamp, a tall man was watching the car directly. Even from a distance, it was clear he wore a dark suit and held his hands in his pockets in a way that suggested familiarity with dangerous situations. The man began to walk slowly toward the car, his steps deliberate and measured like a predator closing in on its prey. Edward felt every muscle in his body contract with tension. His hands shook as he fumbled for the keys in his jacket pocket, his fingers tangling in the expensive fabric that now felt like a trap. "He's coming," the girl whispered, her voice nearly inaudible, but charged with a fear that made Edward realize this was no child's game. "Mister, we have to get out of here, now!" Edward finally found the keys and inserted them into the ignition with uncontrollably shaking hands. The Mercedes's engine purred to life, a sound that usually soothed him but now seemed too loud, too conspicuous. The man in the suit stopped abruptly at the sound of the engine and began to walk faster. "Get down on the floor," Edward instructed the girl, his voice automatically taking on the command tone he used in critical business situations. "Don't let him see you." She obeyed immediately, curling up in the narrow space between the front and back seats. Edward put the car in drive, trying to remain calm as he pulled away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, he could see the man standing where he had been parked, speaking urgently into a phone. Where do I go?" Edward asked, more to himself than to the girl as he turned left at the first corner. His mind, trained to solve complex problems, struggled to find a logical solution to a situation that defied all logic. "You can't go home," the girl said from the floor of the car, her voice muffled. "They know where you live. They said they know all the places you go." Edward felt a chill run down his spine. How could complete strangers know so much about his routine? He had always been discreet, cautious, never following overly predictable patterns, or so he had thought. He drove aimlessly through the downtown streets, constantly checking his mirrors. Occasionally, he'd see headlights that seemed to be following him, but they always disappeared after a few blocks. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe it was real. At that moment, he couldn't tell the difference. "What's your name?" Edward asked, trying to distract her from the fear and to calm his own nerves with conversation. "Sophia," she answered shyly. "Sophia Marie, but everyone just calls me Sophia." "Sophia is a beautiful name," Edward commented, surprised by the tenderness he felt for the child. "Where are your parents, Sophia?" There was a long silence. Edward could only hear the soft hum of the engine and the distant noise of traffic. When Sophia finally spoke, her voice carried a profound sadness that broke his heart. "My mum's real sick in the hospital. She hasn't been able to work for a long time. The money ran out and we had to leave our apartment. Daddy left when I was a baby." Edward swallowed hard. Here was a child facing challenges that he, with all his wealth and power, could barely imagine. And yet, she had risked her own safety to save him. "And you've been sleeping on the street?" Edward asked, his voice softer than he intended. Sometimes I can get into a shelter, but they're always full. The abandoned house is safer than some places." Sophia shifted uncomfortably on the car floor. "Can I sit up on the seat now?" Edward glanced in the mirrors again. The street was relatively empty, just a few scattered cars driving normally. "You can, but stay low, just in case." Sophia settled onto the back seat, and Edward could see her better in the rearview mirror. Even with her dirty clothes and tangled hair, she had intelligent, expressive eyes. There was a premature maturity about her that would break the heart of anyone with a shred of decency. "Mr. Edward," she said hesitantly, "I know you don't know me, but do you believe me?" The question hit Edward unexpectedly. For years, he had built his life on distrusting everyone, on questioning every motive, every gesture. But here, in this impossible situation, he found himself completely believing a child he had met less than an hour ago. Edward drove in silence for another 15 minutes, his hands gradually relaxing on the steering wheel as he processed Sophia's words. Her question echoed in his mind. "Do you believe me?" It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of two lives, his and hers. "Yes, Sophia," he finally answered, surprising himself with the conviction in his own voice. "I believe you." She smiled shyly in the rearview mirror, and Edward felt something warm in his chest. It had been years since he'd felt that sensation, perhaps not since his parents died, when he was still young and dreamed of having a family of his own. "Where are we going?" Sophia asked, looking out the windows at the city lights blurring past. "I don't know yet," Edward admitted. "I need to think of a safe place where we can talk properly. You said they know all the places I go, so my house and my office are out." Edward made a smooth right turn, merging onto a busier avenue. The late-night traffic provided a certain sense of anonymity, just another car among hundreds. He was starting to feel slightly safer when Sophia screamed desperately, "Don't turn at that corner. They said they'd be waiting there." Edward slammed on the brakes instinctively, the car skidding a few feet before coming to a stop. His heart pounded again as he looked at the corner Sophia had indicated, the exact spot where he usually turned to get to the Cypress Grill, his favorite restaurant for late-night dinners after work. "How did you know I was going to turn there?" Edward asked, his voice trembling with shock. "Because they said you always eat at the corner restaurant when you leave work late. They said they were going to wait for you there." Sophia pointed discreetly through the glass. "Look, there are 2 cars parked in weird spots." Edward followed her gaze and felt his blood run cold. There were indeed 2 dark sedans parked in strategic positions, one blocking the exit of the restaurant's parking lot, the other positioned to intercept any vehicle trying to make a U-turn. These were not normal parking spots. They were ambush positions. Men emerged from the shadows between the cars, moving with the coordination of a team that had carefully planned every step. Edward could count at least 4 figures, all wearing dark clothes, all clearly waiting for him. "My God," Edward muttered, his mind struggling to accept the terrifying reality. They really were waiting for me. With trembling hands, he put the car in reverse and slowly backed away from the corner, trying not to draw attention. The men didn't seem to have noticed his presence yet, but it was only a matter of time before they realized their target wasn't coming. "How can a 6-year-old girl know all this?" Edward asked, more to himself than to Sophia. The situation was beyond anything his rational mind could process. "Because I'm a good listener," Sophia answered with a seriousness that was stunning for her age. "On the streets, you learn you have to pay attention to everything. And they talked about you for a long time, said you always do the same things, at the same times." Edward realized that his life, which he believed to be unpredictable and secure, was in fact an open book to anyone who cared to watch. His routines, his habits, his favorite places, they had all become a trap. "Sophia," he said, stopping the car on a quiet residential street and turning completely to look at her. "I need to know everything you heard. Every word, every detail. Our safety depends on it." She nodded gravely, her face taking on a concentrated expression that shouldn't exist on a child. "They said you have a lot of money hidden away in places nobody knows about, and that you have important documents that some people really want." "What kind of documents?" Edward pressed, though he already suspected the answer. "I don't know for sure, but they talked about contracts with Japanese people and about someone named Marcus who's really nervous." Sophia paused, biting her lip. "They laughed when they said Marcus wouldn't have to worry about you anymore after Thursday." Marcus. The name hit Edward like a punch to the gut. Marcus Vance, his partner for 15 years, his best friend since college. The man who knew all his business secrets, all his routines, all his weak spots. Edward sat in silence for long minutes, the name Marcus echoing in his mind like a painful toll. 15 years of partnership, of mutual trust, of shared accomplishments. How was it possible that his best friend was planning his destruction? "Mr. Edward, are you okay?" Sophia asked with concern, noticing how pale he'd become under the yellow light of the nearby streetlight. "I'm trying to understand how I got here," Edward answered honestly. "Marcus, he knows everything about my life, my schedule, my habits, my passwords, my safe houses. If he's really involved in this..." "You trust him a lot?" Sophia asked, with the startling insight she must have developed living on the streets. Edward laughed bitterly. "I did. He was like a brother to me. We built the company together, shared successes and failures. I never questioned a single decision he made." On the streets, you learn that sometimes the people who know you best are the ones who can hurt you the most, Sophia said, with a wisdom that broke Edward's heart, because they know exactly where to hit. Edward looked at this small girl, and felt a profound admiration for her ability to see human nature so clearly. Sophia had learned lessons in a few short years of life that he had taken decades to comprehend. "Sophia," Edward said, an idea starting to form in his mind. "How exactly did you get into my car? You said you saw me give you food last week, but how did you know which car was mine?" Sophia was quiet for a moment, as if deciding whether to trust him completely. Finally, she sighed and began to speak. "After you gave me the sandwich, I started watching you," she admitted shyly. "Not to do anything bad. It's just, nobody had ever been that nice to me. I wanted to see what a good person's life was like." Edward felt his eyes well up. The simplicity and purity of that confession touched him deeply. "So I started watching you from far away. I learned you work in the tall building with the blue glass, that you always leave around the same time, that you like to park on this street." Sophia paused, nervously fiddling with the hem of her worn-out shirt. "I thought you seemed sad, even though you're rich." "Sad?" Edward asked, surprised. "Yeah, you always walk looking at the ground, like you lost something important, and you never smile, not even when you're on the phone." Sophia studied him in the rearview mirror. "My mum says that sometimes rich people are the loneliest people in the world." Edward had to admit that Sophia was right. In recent years, especially after his parents' death, he had become more and more withdrawn. Work had become his only companion, financial success, his only measure of self-worth. "Last night, when I heard the men talking about you in the abandoned house, I got so scared for you," Sophia continued. "They talked like you were a bad thing that needed to be removed, but I knew you. I knew you were a good person." "How did you get into my car?" Edward asked, genuinely curious. Sophia hung her head in shame. I learned how to open car doors on the street. Sometimes it's the only way to have a warm place to sleep when it's really cold, but I never take anything. I just sleep for a little while and leave before the owner comes back." Edward should have been shocked, but instead, he only felt compassion. A 6-year-old child forced to learn survival skills that adults should never have to know. "I opened your car and hid because I knew you'd be coming soon. I waited for 2 hours. Sophia looked at him with pleading eyes. "I didn't know any other way to warn you. I couldn't get near your building because of the security guards. You hid in my car for 2 hours, in the cold, just to warn me about a danger," Edward asked, his voice thick with emotion. Sophia nodded. "You were the only person who was ever good to me without wanting anything in return. I couldn't let them hurt you." Edward had to stop talking for a moment, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. Here was a child who had risked everything, her safety, her freedom, perhaps even her life, to protect a stranger who had given her only a sandwich and $20. Edward discreetly wiped his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to regain his emotional control. Sophia had touched on wounds he had kept carefully hidden for years. The loneliness, the mistrust, the constant feeling that he was surrounded by people only interested in his money. All of it was real, but he had never admitted it, not even to himself. "Sophia, we need to find a safe place where you can rest and I can think about what to do," Edward said, putting the car back in motion. "Are you hungry?" "I am," she admitted shyly. "I haven't eaten anything since yesterday morning." Edward felt a pang of guilt. While he was worrying about corporate mergers and multi-million-dollar profits, a child who had saved his life was starving just a few miles away. "We'll find a place to eat then," he decided, driving toward a part of the city he knew less well. If Sophia was right about Marcus knowing all his habits, he needed to avoid any place he frequented regularly. He found a small 24-hour diner on a busy avenue. The kind of common place where no one would pay special attention to a man in a suit accompanied by a child. He parked in a well-lit spot near the entrance. "I'll go in and get us some food to go," Edward explained. "It's better if we don't stay in one place for too long." Sophia nodded, showing she understood the need for caution. "Can I come with you? I promise to be quiet." Edward hesitated. Sophia's appearance, dirty clothes, unkempt hair, the smell of someone who hadn't showered in days would certainly draw attention, but the thought of leaving her alone in the car, even for a few minutes, made him anxious. Of course, he decided, but we'll say you're my niece, okay? It's easier to explain. They entered the diner together. Edward ordered burgers, fries, sodas, and a hot chocolate for Sophia. As they waited for the order, she leaned against him naturally, as if she really were his niece. The simple gesture awakened a protective instinct in Edward that he didn't know he possessed. "Mr. Edward," Sophia whispered while they waited. "What if they find out where we are?" "They won't," Edward replied, with more confidence than he actually felt. "This isn't a place I ever go to, and we're being careful." They returned to the car with the hot food. Edward drove until he found a well-lit parking lot of a gas station where they could eat without feeling exposed. Sophia devoured her burger with the desperate hunger of someone who had gone too long without a proper meal. "Is it good?" Edward asked, eating more slowly as he watched the genuine satisfaction on her face. "It's the best food I've ever had in my whole life," Sophia replied with her mouth full, her eyes shining with happiness. Edward smiled, the first genuine smile he had given in weeks. "Sophia, I need to ask you something important. Do you remember any other details of what those men said? Anything at all could be helpful." Sophia chewed thoughtfully before answering. "They talked about a meeting that's going to happen on Thursday. They said that after that meeting, you wouldn't be a problem for anyone anymore." "The meeting with the Japanese investors," Edward murmured, the pieces starting to fit together. "It's on Thursday at 2 p.m., the most important contract of my career. They also talked about a woman," Sophia added. "A woman who works with you and is helping them. They said she gets them all the information they need." Edward felt his stomach clench. A woman who worked with him and had access to confidential information. It could be several people: his personal assistant, the CFO, the company lawyer. The possibility that the betrayal was even more widespread than he had imagined made him nauseous. "Did you happen to hear this woman's name?" Edward asked, already dreading the answer. Sophia shook her head. "No. They just said the woman or her, but they seemed to really like her. They laughed when they said you trust her completely." Edward leaned his head back against the driver's seat, closing his eyes. His entire life was falling apart. Not just Marcus, but also a woman he trusted was conspiring against him. How had he been so blind? How had he not seen the signs? "Mr. Edward," Sophia said softly, touching his arm. "You're not alone now. I'll help you." He looked at this small girl, with her dirty but determined face, and felt a strange strength grow inside him. Sophia was right. He wasn't alone anymore. Edward decided he couldn't run forever. He needed answers, and there was only one place he could get them: his own home. If Marcus was truly behind the conspiracy, there would surely be evidence in his personal files, emails, or documents that could reveal the extent of the betrayal. "Sophia, I'm going to take you somewhere safe first," Edward said, finishing his meal. "Then I need to go home and get some important things." "No," Sophia protested immediately. "They said they know your house. It's dangerous." "That's why you're not coming with me," Edward explained patiently. "I'm going to drop you off at a hotel, a place where you can take a hot shower and sleep in a real bed." Sophia shook her head vigorously. "What if something happens to you? What if they're waiting there? I won't be able to warn you again." Edward was touched by her concern, but also determined. "Sophia, I have to do this. I can't live on the run without understanding what's happening." They drove to a modest but secure hotel in a part of the city Edward rarely frequented. He paid for a room in cash, checking in under a false name. Sophia took the longest shower of her life, while Edward bought her new clothes at a nearby 24-hour department store. When he returned to the room, he found Sophia sleeping soundly in the bed, wrapped in the hotel's fluffy bathrobe. She looked even smaller and more fragile when relaxed. away from the constant state of alert that life on the streets demanded. Edward sat in a nearby armchair, watching her sleep and feeling a paternal protectiveness he hadn't experienced in years. 2 hours later, he left Sophia sleeping with a note explaining where he had gone and drove to his mansion on the outskirts of the city. It was almost 3 in the morning when he arrived, and the property was completely dark and silent. Edward parked in the garage and entered through a back door, using only his phone's flashlight to guide him. Everything seemed normal, furniture in place, no sign of a break-in. Maybe Sophia had been wrong about his house being known to the conspirators. He went straight to his private office on the 2nd floor, where he kept his most confidential files. He powered on his computer and began searching for emails exchanged with Marcus over the past few weeks, looking for any hint of suspicious behavior. That's when he found it, a hidden folder on his own computer, a folder he had never created. Inside it, dozens of files with detailed information about his routine, his schedule, his personal habits, daily reports on his movements, long-lens photographs, even recordings of phone conversations. Edward's blood ran cold as he realized someone had turned his own home into a spy hub against him. Worse, the files were recently dated, indicating the surveillance had been going on for weeks. But the most shocking discovery came when he opened an audio file recorded just 2 days earlier. It was a conversation between Marcus and a female voice that Edward recognized immediately, Carla Mendez, his personal assistant for 8 years, the woman he trusted more than anyone else. "The plan is working perfectly, Boo," Carla's voice said. "Edward suspects nothing. On Thursday, during the meeting with the Japanese, we'll activate the final stage." "Are you sure he'll sign the documents?" Marcus asked. "Positive. I've prepared everything to look like a normal part of the contract. When he signs, we'll be transferring not just the company shares, but also access to all the offshore accounts. In 24 hours, Edward Monroe will officially be a broken, mentally unstable man." Edward had to lean on the desk to keep from falling. 8 years of trust, 8 years of sharing secrets, of allowing Carla access to practically everything in his life. She knew his passwords, his codes, his emotional weaknesses, and she was using it all to destroy him. "And after?" Marcus asked in the recording. "After, with the medical reports we've bought and the evidence we've planted, Edward will be committed to a private psychiatric facility, officially for a psychotic break and self-destructive tendencies. No one will believe a word he says." Edward felt nauseous. It wasn't just theft. It was an elaborate plan to destroy his sanity, his reputation, his very existence. And on Thursday, in less than 36 hours, it would all be over. That's when he heard the sound, footsteps on the stairs. Someone was coming up toward the office. Edward quickly shut down the computer and hid behind the curtain, his heart beating so loudly he was sure whoever it was could hear it. The door opened slowly, and through the gap in the curtain, he saw a familiar silhouette enter the room, Carla. She walked through the room with the familiarity of someone who knew every piece of furniture, every drawer. Edward watched in horror as she checked for signs that someone had been there, examining the computer, the papers on his desk. "I know you're here, Edward," she said calmly, without even looking toward the curtain. "Your car is in the garage." Edward remained motionless behind the curtain, every muscle tensed like a cord about to snap. Carla continued to walk around the room with calculated movements, her footsteps muffled by the Persian rug he had chosen himself years ago when he still believed this house would be a safe haven. 8 years working by your side," Carla continued, her voice carrying a conversational tone that made everything even more terrifying. 8 years pretending to admire your intelligence, your dedication, your leadership. Do you have any idea how difficult that was? Edward closed his eyes, trying to control his breathing. Every word was like a stab to wounds he didn't even know he had. "You know what irritated me the most?" Carla stopped in front of the desk where Edward kept a photo of his parents. "It was how you always thought. You were so smart, so careful." "Carla, double-check this document." "Carla, you confirm that information." "As if I were incapable of having plans of my own." Edward heard the sound of shattering glass. She had knocked over the photo. The picture of his parents, who had died 5 years ago in a car crash, now lay destroyed on the floor. Rage began to mix with fear in his chest. Marcus was easier to convince, Carla continued, now rifling through the papers on the desk. "Men always are. I just had to show him how much money we were leaving on the table by settling for salaries when we could have it all. He has gambling debts you can't even imagine, Edward. Your blind trust was always your greatest weakness." Edward felt he couldn't stay hidden much longer. Carla was getting closer to the curtain, and he could hear her breathing getting nearer. "Why, Carla?" Edward finally stepped out from behind the curtain, deciding to face the situation head-on. "Why, after all these years?" Carla didn't seem surprised to see him. On the contrary, she smiled with a coldness Edward had never seen before. "Because you never saw me as a person, Edward. To you, I was always just an extension of your calendar, someone to organize your life while you took all the credit." "I always treated you with respect," Edward protested, struggling to keep his voice calm. "I paid you well, gave you important responsibilities." "Responsibilities?" Carla laughed bitterly. "You gave me the responsibility of cleaning up your messes, of lying to your mistresses when you got tired of them, of making excuses to your family when you were too busy to visit them before they died." The mention of his parents hit Edward like a punch to the gut. It was true. He had asked Carla to cancel countless family lunches and dinners because he was busy with business. Business that he now realized was less important than he had imagined. "But that doesn't justify what you're doing," Edward said, trying to regain some control of the situation. "Stealing the company, having me committed." "Committed?" Carla feigned surprise. "Oh, Edward, you still don't understand the full scope of the plan, do you? The commitment is just the beginning." Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. What do you mean?" "Marcus and I don't just want your company and your money," Carla explained with terrifying calmness. "We want your complete and utter destruction, physical, mental, emotional. You will spend the rest of your life in a psychiatric facility, medicated until you can't remember your own name." "You're insane," Edward whispered, finally grasping the magnitude of the betrayal. "Insane," Carla laughed again. "I'm being practical. Men like you, Edward, don't learn their lesson with half measures. You always find a way to bounce back, to get back on top. The only way to ensure you'll never bother anyone again is to destroy you completely." Edward tried to move toward the door, but Carla blocked his path. "Not so fast. We still have to talk about your little friend." Edward's blood ran cold. "What little friend?" "The street kid you've been driving around tonight." "Did you think we didn't know?" Carla smiled maliciously. "We've had people watching you for weeks, Edward. We saw you at the diner, at the hotel. A very brave little girl, by the way." "Sophia has nothing to do with this," Edward said, his voice laced with desperation and fury. "She does now. She heard things she shouldn't have, and you, for some incomprehensible reason, decided to believe a homeless child instead of the people who have worked with you for years." Carla took her phone out of her pocket. "But don't worry, we've already sent someone to pick her up." Edward felt as if the floor had vanished from under his feet. Sophia was in danger because of him, because of his own naivety in thinking he could protect her by leaving her alone at the hotel. Edward couldn't think straight. The image of Sophia being captured by unknown men clouded his mind, awakening a desperation he had never experienced. That brave girl had risked everything to save him, and now she was in mortal danger because of his foolishness. "Where is she?" Edward demanded, advancing on Carla. "What have you done to Sophia?" "Nothing yet," Carla replied calmly, holding her phone like a weapon. "But that depends entirely on you, Edward. We can resolve this in a civilized manner." Or what?" Edward interrupted. his voice filled with a fury that surprised even him. "Or the little girl will learn that sometimes it's dangerous to help the wrong people," Carla finished coldly. "The choice is yours." Edward wanted to lunge at her, to snatch the phone from her hands, but he forced himself to think strategically. If Sophia was already in their hands, acting on impulse would only make things worse. "What do you want?" Edward asked, fighting to keep his voice controlled. "Simple. Tomorrow, you will attend the meeting with the Japanese exactly as planned. You will sign all the documents I've prepared, no questions asked. And then you will voluntarily check yourself into the psychiatric clinic we've selected. And Sophia, she will be released as soon as you're checked in and sedated," Carla promised. "One more street kid, more or less, makes no difference to anyone. As long as you cooperate." Edward knew he couldn't trust a word Carla said. If she could betray him after 8 years, she certainly wouldn't keep a promise made under blackmail, but he needed to buy time, to think of a strategy. "How do I know you won't hurt her even if I cooperate?" Edward asked. "You don't, but it's the only chance she has." Carla checked the time on her phone. "It's almost 4 a.m. The meeting is at 2 p.m. You have 10 hours to decide if that girl's life is worth more than your freedom." Edward clenched his fists, fighting the feeling of total helplessness. "Why are you doing this to an innocent child?" "Because you made her a part of this," Carla answered without a hint of remorse. "When you decided to trust her over the right people, you put her in the middle of a corporate war. The consequences are yours. She's just a 6-year-old girl. A 6-year-old girl who knows details about our plans," Carla corrected. "A girl who could become a problem in the future. You understand our position." Edward understood perfectly, and the understanding made him sick. Sophia wasn't just a hostage, she was a witness they intended to eliminate regardless of his cooperation. "I need time to think," Edward said, trying to give the impression he was considering her offer. "There's not much to think about," Carla replied, "but you have until noon to give me your final answer. After that," she made a vague gesture with her hand that Edward interpreted as a direct threat to Sophia's life. Carla walked to the door but paused in the doorway. "Oh, and Edward, just so you don't try anything heroic, we have cameras monitoring your every move. Any attempt to contact the police or seek outside help will result in immediate consequences for your little friend." Edward was left alone in his office, surrounded by the wreckage of his former life. The broken picture of his parents on the floor seemed to symbolize everything he had lost by trusting the wrong people. But this time, it wasn't just about him. Sophia was paying the price for his kindness. He needed a plan. He had to find a way to save Sophia without surrendering his own life to the conspirators. But how could he fight people who knew his every move, who had unlimited resources and no moral scruples? Edward looked out the office window, watching the sky begin to lighten. He still had a few hours before Carla expected his answer, a few hours to find a way to turn the tables. That's when he remembered something Sophia had said. On the streets, you learn you have to pay attention to everything. Maybe she had left clues about where she was being held. Maybe, in her careful observation of the world around her, she had noticed details that could help him find her. Edward left the house quickly, driving back to the hotel where he had left Sophia. Maybe there was still time. Maybe she had managed to escape or hide. Maybe hope wasn't completely lost. Edward arrived at the hotel with his heart pounding, and parking haphazardly in a spot near the entrance. He ran through the hallways, taking the stairs 2 at a time until he reached the room where he had left Sophia. His hands trembled as he inserted the keycard into the lock. The room was empty. The unmade bed still held the small impression of Sophia's body, and her old clothes were discarded in the bathroom, along with damp towels. But she was gone. On the nightstand, Edward found the note he had left explaining where he was going, but there was another message written in a child's handwriting on the back. "Mr. Edward, men came for me. I heard them talking. They're taking me to the abandoned house near the overpass, the same place where I heard them planning to hurt you. Be careful. They said you'll try to save me, and they'll be waiting. I'm not scared. You taught me that good people always find a way. I love you like you're my real dad, Sophia. Edward had to sit on the bed to keep from collapsing. Even while being kidnapped, Sophia had found a way to leave information that could save them. That extraordinary girl, even in mortal danger, was thinking of protecting him. But the message also confirmed his worst fears. It was a trap. Carla and Marcus knew he would try to rescue Sophia, and they would be prepared to capture him as well. The abandoned house would be surrounded, watched, a death trap from which it would be impossible to escape. Edward studied the note again, looking for additional clues. Sophia was smart. Perhaps she had left more subtle information. That's when he noticed something strange about how she had written overpass. There was a small mark before the word, almost imperceptible. Looking closer, he realized it wasn't just a mark. It was a tiny number written in pencil. 3. Sophia had discreetly marked the number 3 before the word overpass. Edward knew the area where Sophia said she'd overheard the conspirators well. There were 3 main overpasses in that part of the city. Sophia was indicating which one, even knowing it would be dangerous information if it fell into the wrong hands. He pocketed the note and hurried down to his car. He didn't have an elaborate plan, but he knew he couldn't abandon Sophia. She had risked everything for him. Now it was his turn to do the same for her. On the way to overpass number 3, Edward tried to think strategically. He couldn't just show up at the abandoned house. He'd be captured immediately. He needed a different approach, something Carla and Marcus wouldn't expect. That's when he remembered Sophia's words. On the streets. You learn you have to pay attention to everything. Maybe the answer wasn't to attack directly, but to observe first, to learn the kidnappers' patterns, to find a weakness. Edward parked several blocks away from the overpass area and continued on foot. The neighborhood was run down, full of abandoned buildings and vacant lots, perfect for activities that needed to go unnoticed. He found the abandoned house without difficulty. It was an old 2-story house with boarded-up windows and an overgrown yard. 2 cars were parked out front, and Edward could see silhouettes moving behind the makeshift curtains. He decided to circle the building, looking for other ways in. Around back, he found a basement window that was only propped shut. Through it, he could hear muffled voices coming from somewhere on the floor above. Edward waited until he was sure no one was watching the back of the house, then carefully forced the window and slipped into the dark basement. The smell of mold and dampness was suffocating, but he moved silently between old boxes and broken furniture toward the stairs. From the floor above, he could hear conversations more clearly. He recognized Marcus's voice, arguing with other men about timelines and checkpoints. But he didn't hear Sophia. Edward climbed the old stairs, avoiding the steps that looked most worn and likely to creak. He reached a half-open door that led to the house's kitchen. Through the crack, he could see part of the main living room. Marcus was sitting in an old chair, talking on the phone. No, she hasn't said anything yet, but it's a matter of time. Kids always talk when they get scared enough. Edward felt rage boil in his veins. Where was Sophia? What were they doing to her? That's when he heard a sound that made his heart stop. A low, muffled cry coming from somewhere upstairs. It was Sophia. She was alive, but obviously in distress. Edward knew he had only one chance. If he was discovered, both he and Sophia would be lost. But he couldn't just stand there listening while an innocent child suffered because of his corporate war. Edward forced himself to stay calm as he analyzed the situation. He had to get to Sophia without alerting the kidnappers, but the house was old, and every movement could make a sound that would give him away. The muffled crying continued from the upper floor, each of Sophia's sobs piercing his heart like a blade. He waited for Marcus to finish his call and leave the room before he moved. He crossed the kitchen silently, avoiding the pieces of wood and glass scattered on the floor. The staircase to the second floor was in the main hall, but he would have to pass the living room, where at least two men were talking in low voices. Edward took a deep breath and started up the stairs, step by step, testing each tread before putting his full weight on it. The old wood groaned softly, but the sounds from the living room masked the minor noises. On the second floor, there were 3 doors. The crying was coming from the last door on the right. Edward approached carefully, pressing his ear to the wood. He could hear Sophia trying to control her crying, whispering something softly. It sounded like she was talking to herself, maybe trying to calm down. The door wasn't locked. Edward opened it inch by inch until he could see inside the room. Sophia was sitting in a corner, hugging her knees, her face swollen from crying. Her new clothes were dirty and torn, and there was a small cut on her right arm. When she saw him, her eyes widened in surprise and relief. Edward gestured for her to stay silent and slipped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Mr. Edward," Sophia whispered, running to hug him, "I knew you would come for me." Edward wrapped her in his arms, feeling how she trembled. "It's okay now," he murmured in her ear. "We're getting out of here." "They asked me questions about you," Sophia whispered urgently. "They wanted to know everything you told me, where you keep important papers." "I didn't say anything, but they got really mad." Edward examined the cut on her arm, feeling rage boil in his veins. "Did they hurt you?" "It was just a little cut when I tried to run away," Sophia explained, trying to downplay it. "But Mr. Edward, I found out something really important." "What?" "They don't know I heard the lady with the yellow hair," Sophia whispered quickly. "She came here an hour ago and said things they don't think I understood." Edward crouched down to Sophia's level. "What things?" "The lady said you won't be a problem after Thursday, but that she needs something hidden in your house, something about accounts in other countries and money nobody knows exists." Edward nodded. Carla was after his offshore accounts, money he had legally put aside in other countries as a hedge against economic instability. It was a significant sum, enough to set a person up for life. "But there's more," Sophia continued. "She was fighting with the man you called Marcus. She said he's spending too much money on games and that if he doesn't stop, she'll tell everyone about the fake documents." Edward felt a spark of hope. If Carla and Marcus were fighting, there might be a way to use that to his advantage. "Sophia," Edward whispered, "I need to ask you something very important. Did you see if they have guards watching the whole house?" "There's one man in front and another in the back," Sophia answered immediately. "But I saw through the window that the man in the back falls asleep sometimes. And there's a car with 2 people, but they left about 20 minutes ago to get food." Edward smiled despite the situation. Sophia had observed and memorized every important detail, even while scared and hurt. "Papa, Edward," Sophia said, touching his face with her small, dirty hands. "They said they'll hurt me if you don't do what they want, but I don't want you to give up because of me." "Sophia, look at me," Edward said firmly. "I will never abandon you, ever. You risked your life to save me, and now it's my turn to protect you. But what if we can't get away?" Edward looked into the determined eyes of that brave little girl and felt a strength he didn't know he possessed. "We will, because we're a family now, and families take care of each other." Sophia smiled through her tears. "A real family. The realest one there is," Edward promised, sealing a pact that would change their lives forever. But first, they needed to get out of there alive. Edward and Sophia prepared for the most important escape of their lives. They had a small window of opportunity. The back guard was dozing, the men had gone for food, and Marcus was downstairs, unaware that Edward was in the house. "Remember what we agreed on?" Edward whispered as he checked that the hallway was clear. "You go first, very slowly. If I do this," he demonstrated a gesture with his hand, "you stop and stay completely still." Sophia nodded, showing a courage that impressed Edward more with each passing moment. They left the room and began to descend the stairs, each step calculated and silent. Edward could hear Marcus on the phone in the main room, his irritated voice discussing deadlines and wire transfers. They reached the ground floor without incident. Edward pointed Sophia toward the kitchen, and from there they could reach the basement window he'd entered through. They had almost made it when they heard the sound of cars pulling up outside. "Damn it," Edward muttered, recognizing their 20-minute advantage was over. The men were back with the food. Sophia pulled on his sleeve, pointing to a large cabinet in the kitchen. "In there, Papa," she whispered desperately. They squeezed into the old pantry, closing the door just as they heard male voices entering the house. Edward held Sophia against his chest, feeling her heart beating rapidly against his own. "Where's the girl?" a gruff voice asked. "In the room where we left her," Marcus answered. "Why?" "Because the security lead said he saw some strange movement around the back of the house a few minutes ago." Edward felt Sophia tremble in his arms. They had been discovered, or at least suspected. It was a matter of minutes before they checked the room and found Sophia gone. "Go check," Marcus ordered, "and check all the windows. Maybe some homeless person tried to get in." Heavy footsteps ascended the stairs. Edward knew they had seconds before the empty room was discovered. He had to make a quick decision, try to escape or create a distraction. "Sophia," he whispered in her ear, "when I leave this pantry, you run for the basement window and don't look back. Understand?" "What about you?" she asked, terror in her voice. "I'll find you, I promise." Before Sophia could protest, Edward heard the shout from upstairs. "The girl's gone. She's not here." Immediately, the whole house went on alert. Footsteps ran in every direction, voices shouted orders, doors slammed violently. Edward pushed Sophia toward the basement. "Go, now." She hesitated for a second, then ran in the direction he'd pointed. Edward headed for the main living room, deciding to face the situation head-on. If he was going to be captured anyway, he would at least ensure Sophia had a chance to escape. "Marcus!" Edward shouted, entering the room with his hands raised. "I'm here, stop looking." Marcus spun around, surprised and furious. "Edward, how did you—" "I came for Sophia," Edward said calmly. "And now I want to make a deal." "What kind of deal?" Marcus asked, as the other men surrounded Edward with guns drawn. "I'll turn myself in voluntarily. I'll sign any documents you want, transfer all the money, agree to be committed. But Sophia walks free." Marcus laughed cynically. "You're in no position to make deals, Edward. We have you and we'll find the girl in a matter of minutes." "You won't find her," Edward bluffed. "I sent her somewhere you'll never think to look. And she has instructions to go straight to the police if I don't show up in 2 hours. Marcus's expression changed. "You're lying." "Want to bet everyone's freedom on it?" Edward challenged. "Sophia knows everything. Names, dates, locations. She's smarter than you think." Just then, Carla entered the room, her hair disheveled and her expression furious. "What is going on here?" "Edward showed up and helped the girl escape," Marcus explained quickly. Carla looked at Edward with pure hatred. "You have no idea what you've just done." "I did what I had to do," Edward replied. "I protected an innocent child." "Innocent?" Carla laughed bitterly. "That girl just signed her own death warrant, Edward. And yours too." It was then that they all heard a sound that made Edward's blood run cold. Sophia screaming for help from outside the house. "Looks like we found your little friend," Carla said with evil satisfaction. "And now you'll both pay for all the complications you've caused." Edward was forced outside by the armed men, where he found Sophia being held by 2 thugs. She had made it almost to the street, but had been caught before she could get away completely. Her eyes met Edward's, and he saw in them not fear, but determination. "Papa, Edward!" Sophia yelled. "I did it! I did it!" Edward didn't understand what she meant at first, but Carla and Marcus seemed equally confused by the girl's triumphant exclamation. "Did what, you little pest?" Marcus demanded, shaking Sophia by the shoulders. I managed to call the police before you caught me," Sophia answered with a smile that didn't fit the situation. And that's not all." Edward felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. If Sophia had really contacted the police, it could save them, but it could also enrage the kidnappers even more. "You're lying," Carla said, but her voice carried an uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "I'm not," Sophia replied with impressive conviction. "And there's something else you don't know. I recorded everything." "Recorded what?" Edward asked, genuinely surprised. Sophia pulled a small device from her pocket that Edward recognized immediately. It was one of the digital recorders he kept in his office for important meetings. She must have grabbed it when they were at his house. "I recorded the conversation between the lady with the yellow hair and Marcus when they thought I was asleep," Sophia explained. "They talked about fake documents, about how they're going to make Papa Edward look crazy, about the money hidden in other countries." Carla turned visibly pale. "That's impossible. You're just a child." "I'm a child who knows how to hide and listen," Sophia corrected. "And I also know you two were fighting because Marcus owes a lot of money to dangerous people, and you're worried he's going to mess everything up." Marcus lunged furiously towards Sophia, but Edward put himself between them. "Don't touch her!" "You don't understand," Marcus screamed. "Completely losing control. I need that money. I owe $3 million to people who don't accept excuses. And for that, you decided to destroy your best friend's life," Edward asked with contempt. "Best friend?" Marcus laughed hysterically. "You never saw me as an equal, Edward. You were always the genius, the leader, the one making the important decisions. I was just the junior partner who signed papers." "That's not true," Edward protested. "Isn't it?" Marcus continued. "When was the last time you consulted me on a strategic decision? When was the last time you publicly acknowledged my contribution to the company?" Edward fell silent, realizing there was painful truth in Marcus's words. In his ambition and perfectionism, he had perhaps truly marginalized his partner without realizing it. "But that doesn't justify," Edward began. "Enough talk," Carla interrupted. "We have a bigger problem now. If the girl really contacted the police..." Just then, they heard the distant sound of sirens. Sophia smiled triumphantly. "I told you I did it." The armed men grew visibly nervous, looking to Carla and Marcus for instructions. The sirens were getting closer, and it was obvious they had only minutes before the police arrived. "We're leaving," one of the thugs announced. "We're not paid to take on the cops." "You can't abandon us now," Carla screamed. But the men were already running for their cars. In seconds, only Edward, Sophia, Carla, and Marcus remained on the grounds of the abandoned house. "It's over, Carla," Edward said calmly. "You've lost." "Not yet," Carla replied, pulling a small pistol from her pocket. "If I can't have your company, at least I can make sure you'll never get in anyone's way again." Edward instinctively pushed Sophia behind him, shielding her with his body. "Carla, don't do this," Marcus pleaded, finally seeming to realize the situation had spiraled completely out of control. It wasn't supposed to go this far. "You're a coward," Carla spat at Marcus. "You always were. That's why this plan failed." The sirens were now on their street, and police voices could be heard approaching the house. "Police! The house is surrounded!" Carla looked around desperately, the gun trembling in her hands. Edward could see she was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, which made her even more dangerous. "Sophia," Edward whispered without taking his eyes off Carla, "when I say now, you run to the officers." "Not without you," Sophia replied with determination. "Now!" Edward yelled, lunging toward Carla just as several police officers stormed the property. 4 weeks had passed since that terrible night that changed everything forever. Edward was sitting on the porch of his renovated house, watching Sophia play in the garden with the new doll he had bought her. The afternoon sun created golden highlights in her clean, well-kept hair, and her crystal-clear laughter echoed through the space that now truly felt like a home. The transformation in their lives had been complete. Carla and Marcus were in custody, awaiting trial for conspiracy, kidnapping, and attempted corporate fraud. Sophia's recordings and the evidence found on Edward's computer were more than enough to ensure justice would be served. The company had not only survived the scandal but was thriving under new management, with Edward taking a more humane and collaborative role. "Papa Edward," Sophia called from the garden, using the title they had chosen together after the adoption process was finalized. "Come see what I planted." Edward smiled, rising from the chair where he'd been reading company reports, something he now did for only 2 hours a day, reserving the rest of his time for what truly mattered. He joined Sophia by the small flower bed she had created, where tiny green shoots were beginning to emerge from the dark soil. "They're flowers," Sophia explained proudly. "Auntie Maria from the hospital said they'll be really pretty when they grow up." Maria, Sophia's mother, had made a full recovery after receiving the proper medical treatment Edward had funded. She now lived in a small but comfortable house just 2 blocks away, allowing Sophia to maintain a constant connection with both her families, the one she was born into and the one she had chosen. "They're already beautiful," Edward said, kneeling beside Sophia, "just like the girl who planted them." Sophia threw herself into his arms, hugging him with the full force of her 6 years. "Papa Edward, can I ask you a question?" "Always," he replied, as he did every time she used that phrase. "Do you still get sad sometimes? Like when you found out your friends weren't real friends?" Edward paused, considering the question with the seriousness Sophia deserved. It was one of the things he admired most about her, her ability to ask deep, genuine questions about complex feelings. "Yes, I do get sad sometimes," he admitted honestly. "But you know what I've discovered. The sadness doesn't last forever when you have people who truly love you." "Like I love you," Sophia declared with enthusiasm. "Like you love me," Edward confirmed, feeling his eyes well up with tears of gratitude. "And like I love you, too." They sat in the garden as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Edward thought about how drastically his life had changed. From a lonely, distrustful man to a dedicated father who had found real purpose beyond financial success. "Papa Edward," Sophia said sleepily, resting her head on his shoulder, "do you remember that night in your car?" "I do. Why?" "I'm glad it happened," she said with surprising simplicity. "Because if it hadn't, we never would have become a family." Edward felt his heart tighten with emotion. Sophia was right. That terrifying night had, paradoxically, been the best thing that had ever happened to him. He had lost a company built on betrayal and gained a family built on true love. "I'm glad too," he murmured, kissing the top of her head. "Very glad." As the first stars began to appear in the dark sky, Edward carried a sleeping Sophia inside, placing her carefully in her bed, the room they had decorated together, filled with books, toys, and the colorful drawings she made at school. As he tucked her in with the soft blanket, Edward reflected on the lessons a 6-year-old had taught him about courage, loyalty, and unconditional love. Sophia had risked everything to save a stranger, and in return had gained the stable family she had always dreamed of. That night, for the first time in years, Edward slept deeply and without a care. There were no more hidden bugs, no more conspiracies, no more loneliness. There was only a house full of love, a bright future, and an extraordinary daughter who had turned his empty existence into a life full of meaning. The bug that was meant to be his destruction had become the catalyst for the greatest blessing of his life. And Sophia, the brave girl who watched the world from the shadows, now had her own hero story in a family where she was seen, loved, and valued as she deserved.